afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. So my name is Roberta Lepre, and I am here today as the manager of Europe Direct Core Platform, which is a Europe Direct Center hosted by Core Platform, the NGO, which, as you know, is also the driver of the Diversity Charter. And today we're going to be discussing a very important topic, which is women on boards. But before we delve into that, perhaps you'll allow me just a couple of minutes to explain the role of a Europe Direct Center for those of you who perhaps aren't familiar. So essentially, Europe Direct is one of the main tools of the European Commission. So the Europe Direct Centers are essentially an extension of the European Commission on the ground. And the mission of Europe Direct Centers is to provide information about the EU and also referring people seeking information to specialized information services. And Europe Direct Centers also serve to stimulate debate on EU priorities, on initiatives, policies, and legislation, which is essentially what we will be doing also today throughout this session. So in order to do so, we organize events, conferences, and seminars. We assist individuals and organizations in their inquiries and in their requests for information. We provide information about ongoing EU initiatives and priorities, and we also coordinate with other stakeholders, both in Malta and in Gozo, to reach out to specific target audiences in the most effective way. In the Maltese Islands, we have 3 Europe Direct Centers. There is Europe Direct Valletta, which is hosted by SEM, which is Servizi Europei Malta. We have a Europe Direct Center also in Gozo, which is hosted by the Gozo Business Chamber. And then we also have Europe Direct Core Platform, which is, as I mentioned earlier, also hosted by Core Platform. So on to today's topic, the Women on Boards Directive. So this is the short title of this directive. The longer title is the Directive of the European Parliament and of the Council on improving the gender balance amongst directors of listed companies and related measures. It's an EU initiative. It was officially adopted in November 2022 after over 10 years of discussions and negotiations, because there were a lot of mixed opinions and mixed reactions to this directive. Why? Because essentially the directive sets mandatory quotas for women's representation on the boards of large companies across the EU, so it does not apply to every company. The idea, why do we need this directive? Essentially, it's because we know that there is persistent gender imbalance in corporate leadership across the EU. This is a European problem, which is not only present in one or a few countries, but it's persistent across all the different EU countries, because women have been historically underrepresented when it comes to decision-making. So decision-making is essentially the political sphere, which is not the scope of this directive. And then there is also the corporate, the commercial sphere. So despite making up around half of the EU workforce and also more than half of university graduates, we still did not have an adequate gender balance when it comes to decision-making. And the gender gap in senior management and in board positions is particularly prominent when it comes to large publicly listed companies. So we also know from recent data published by the European Institute for Gender Equality that the proportion of women on the boards of the largest publicly listed companies in Malta is the lowest in amongst the lowest in the European Union, at 17.5% compared to a European average of 33.8%. So this is a particularly problematic issue for Malta. So what are the objectives of the directive? Essentially, to address the persistent gender imbalance in corporate leadership, and in doing so, ensure more fairness and more equality of opportunity for women or the underrepresented sex in the corporate world, and also help to break the so-called glass ceiling, when an individual manages to progress up to a certain level, but then it feels stuck, and there are hurdles, many times structural hurdles, that prevent that person from progressing further. So with this directive, one of the objectives is to break the so-called glass ceiling. Most importantly, however, I think we need to emphasize the fact that by promoting diversity, we are improving corporate governance. So diversity is, in fact, an indicator of good governance. Those of you who have started with their ESG journeys and ESG reporting, you know that, in fact, this is one of the criteria that as a company you would be requested to report upon when it comes to the G pillar of ESG. So diversity is not only good for the individuals concerned, but it is also good for the company as a whole. It improves corporate governance. Why? By positively impacting company performance and decision-making, which should come kind of it's like a natural consequence now of having people taking decisions who have different attributes, different experiences, different skills, different mindset. So obviously the decision-making process will improve. And with this directive, the European Union also seeks to hold companies accountable now, because it's going to ask them to demonstrate their progress towards gender balance. So they're being asked to be accountable, so to speak, not just talk the talk, but also walk the walk. What are the targets of the directive? It is asking companies within scope to ensure that 40% of its non-executive directors should be women, or else 33% of all directors, be it executive or non-executive directors, they should be women. I'd like to say that although the directive was enacted in 2022, it comes into effect in 2026. So we still have over a year to prepare for those of you who are within the scope of the directive. In terms of effects, as I mentioned, by June 2026, the larger EU-listed companies will have to comply with the directive by meeting the established quotas, and failure to meet these targets could result in penalties or other consequences. But we would need to see, in terms of the national transposition, what the sanctions, the specific sanctions will be. It will also help to improve transparency. So companies will have to be transparent about the gender composition of their boards. I'd like to also underline the fact that many of these publicly listed companies would also fall within the scope of the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And so they will also have to report this information within the context of that directives. And if the targets aren't met, they would need to report their progress annually. We are also anticipating a broader corporate cultural shift. So although there are only some companies which are in scope of the directive, it will help to start changing mindsets, even for those companies that are not within the scope of the directive. So strictly speaking, they are not legally obliged to comply. So the directive encourages companies to actively promote gender equality at all levels of the organization, not just at the board level as well. So this is also in line with the commitments that many of you have undertaken by signing the charter. So the overall aim would be to create a more diverse and inclusive corporate culture. And it will also help to increase female representation, again, at all levels of the organization, including key leadership positions. And it will help to drive decision-making in a wider range of industries. So these are the anticipated effects of the directive. When it comes to the impact on Malta, we know, and I have mentioned also at the beginning, that we have very low female representation. So the directive is likely to bring about significant changes in Malta, where probably the culture, not so much the legal, but more the cultural and structural barriers to gender diversity are still very much prevalent, notwithstanding the fact that we have so many very well qualified women as well as men, of course. And this directive will therefore help us to push for structural reforms to meet the targets of the directive. The companies that fall within scope, but also others, will be expected to be proactive in terms of developing a pipeline of potential leaders within their organization. So they will be looking at potential leadership training for women, mentorship programs, which with CORE, we have also developed a very effective mentorship program for female leaders. And also it will help to make recruitment processes more inclusive. So this will undoubtedly lead to greater awareness when it comes to policy issues like, for example, the gender pay gap, work-life balance, and maternity and paternity, and also parental leave. When it comes to business adaptation, yes, companies in Malta might face some short-term challenges when it comes to finding qualified female candidates for board positions. We know that it's very often always the same people, not just women, but very often the same people who are asked to join a board and to take on decision-making positions. However, in anticipation of this directive, we are already seeing that there are initiatives to promote female talent development. Of course, as I said earlier, it's not a matter of not having qualified people, but perhaps they were not being nurtured and trained to tap into those positions. So we have, let's say, a year and a little bit more to make sure that we create the pipeline of leaders that we will be needing. As I mentioned, not all companies will be within scope of this directive. We know that the majority of companies in Malta are SMEs. Actually, the vast majority are micro businesses, so very, very small companies. However, as we are seeing with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, this is also having a ripple effect on the smaller companies, especially those who work within the supply chain of larger companies. So we are anticipating that smaller companies will also respond within the spirit of the directive, and they will also do their part to boost female representation within the company's governance structures. And I'm sure that many of you here, signatories of the Diversity Charter, you are committing to these initiatives, not because you have to, there is no law obliging you to do it, but you appreciate the fact that this adds value to society, but will also add value to your organizations. So how should businesses respond? Of course, working to create a pipeline of talented women as well as men who can rise to leadership positions. I have no doubt that we have very skilled, very qualified individuals who, with the right help and support and mentoring, can actually be very effective leaders. And we will also undoubtedly have to ensure that the selection processes, when it comes to deciding who should take on these leadership positions, that process should be more transparent. So companies will need to show that their processes are transparent and that they are based on merit and they are not made based on any form of gender bias or any other criteria which is not related to merit or skill. We're also anticipating that businesses would need to review and update, obviously, their corporate governance policies. Again, this can be done within the broader ESG mindset. So companies can align with the requirements of this directive and also, by doing so, improve their ESG credentials, especially when it comes to diversity within the S pillar of ESG, or we can also refer to it as corporate social responsibility. Ultimately, we're talking about sustainability. And companies might also need to expand their networks, therefore, to recruit women for board positions, because as I mentioned earlier, usually you always think of the usual pool of people. So we need to broaden our networks to be able to meet and identify other potential valid candidates. So perhaps we might need to look outside our industry and sometimes also beyond national borders to find such qualified female candidates who would also be willing to take on these roles. Compliance and reporting, obviously, in order to avoid penalties, companies should establish their own internal reporting systems to make sure that they set targets and they are progressing towards those targets. And maybe more importantly, we need to make sure that we work on our organizational culture to promote a mindset where diversity and inclusion is valued. So this should not be a matter of compliance, but it should be part and parcel of our corporate DNA, of our value system, and of the broader strategy of the organization. So this might require maybe tweaking our HR practices and also investing a little bit in change management and corporate attitudes that might need to evolve over time and fostering environments where everyone, men and women, can equally thrive. In terms of long-term impact, as I mentioned earlier, we have a body of research that's showing us that diverse boards actually perform better. So we are anticipating improvement when it comes to profitability, risk management, innovation, and governance more broadly. We're also anticipating new leadership models which companies might adopt, and this by encouraging decision-making styles which are more inclusive and more collaborative. So this is also a change in leadership styles and leadership cultures as well. And we aim also to ensure that we inspire younger generations, especially females, for them to be able to aspire to leadership roles, believe that they can achieve these roles and also function very well within these roles because they have a very valid contribution to make in different sectors, even sectors which are traditionally dominated by men such as finance, technology, and engineering. So in conclusion, of course, this directive is a major milestone when it comes to gender equality in Europe. Its impact will be felt across the different member states, obviously including Malta, where perhaps this challenge, let's say, is a little bit more prominent. But it's very important that we identify the opportunities within this process of change, because ultimately companies that embrace the directive and diversity more broadly in a proactive way by developing female talent, ensuring a transparent selection process, and fostering inclusive culture, they will in turn gain a competitive advantage and contribute overall to a broader societal shift towards fairness and justice and equality. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you will have a very interesting and engaging discussion around this topic and come up with some ideas, even by looking at your commitments in the Charter, on how you can turn these commitments into a reality for your organization and for Malta ultimately. Thank you.